All right, well, thank you everyone for joining today, and thank you for letting me come to your meeting. I really appreciate it. So I have been an in-house attorney for a long time at VMware, at ServiceNow. I now run my own practice, and I focus primarily on open source compliance with small to large companies, so a large variety of companies, a lot of whom just take in open source, but also a lot of whom are also open source companies themselves. So with that, let's just jump right in. And there aren't that many of us, so I think, if you have questions as we're going along, I think just feel free to ask. I don't think you necessarily have to wait for a Q&A. And then I think perhaps that'll spark a good discussion amongst all of us because you probably have similar questions. All right, so let's just get going. Okay, so the focus of today is going to be about creating a comprehensive third-party package licensing policy. So I think the first question here, let's see if I can, there we go. Yep. Okay, so the first question here is, why are we talking about third-party packages? Isn't this supposed to be a talk about open source? So once you guys start doing an open source process, you're probably going to be using some sort of scanning tool in order to help you out. And it's likely to turn up a lot of different things that are not going to be purely open source. So what I mean by that is that, there's 82 licenses approved by the Open Source Initiative, about 100 approved by the Free Software Foundation. There's 348 recognized by SPDX. And there's a wide variety of other things out there that don't necessarily conform to, the Open Source Initiative definition of open source or the Free Software Foundation. And your searches, your audits are going to turn up all of these things and not just pure open source. So I think talking about them and knowing how to deal with them and how to think about them is also a critical part of this process. And in fact, I think that one of the biggest challenges that you're going to face is actually identifying what you're looking at. That can be pretty simple if the package just plain says, this is under Eclipse 1.0. But you're going to see a lot of licenses where it's going to be kind of hard to tell what it is. And there are a lot of licenses that look pretty similar and look like they're going to be permissive, but if you read them really closely, might have additional provisions or limitations that you weren't expecting. Anyone in the world is free to come up with any license at any time, so you have to be ready to look at things that maybe you haven't seen before. And so that's part of what we're going to talk about today. And another big part of this is that, as I mentioned, your scanning tools are probably also going to turn up commercial packages. In some cases, that's okay, because it's probably commercial packages that you've bought and paid for. But you might also turn up commercial packages which you didn't know you were using and which you don't think you have a proper license for. And so that's another reason why we call this a third-party package compliance process and not just an open source compliance process. Your tools are likely to turn up all of it. Okay, so what I want to do today with you guys is I actually want to walk you through the process that I go through with new clients who ask me to create open source policies for them. So I'm going to kind of give you guys a peek under the hood of what we talk about and what kind of considerations there are in order to create that policy for them. So you guys are getting an inside view. So one thing to know is that a lot of times people say, oh, we'd like to create, an open source policy. In our case, a third-party package policy. But the reality is that you're probably going to be creating more than one. So you're probably going to create one for proprietary distributed products. You're probably going to have another one for proprietary SaaS products, yet another one for mobile applications, a different one for operating systems that might be part of virtual appliances or containers, different policies for open source products that you might be creating. So the reality is you're creating more than one, and they have to be different, and we'll talk about why later as we go on through this presentation. You're also probably going to have a different policy for things that you use only for internal use, so things that you use for development and testing. So let's move on. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do when we're trying to create a third-party package policy is we need to get a sense of what all the products are in your company. And that may sound simple, but can cause people a little bit of heartache because they don't understand quite how broad this question really is, because we're not just talking about products that people sell, right? We're also talking about things that you make available to customers or partners. And so this might be tools, it might be SDKs, it might be mobile applications, It could be JavaScript that's part of like some of your websites or your SaaS offerings. So this is actually a pretty broad list of things that you may make available to third parties. And it's important to keep this list broad and to think a little bit hard about what should be included. But you really want to be thorough on this part of the process. So step 2 is create profiles for each of those products that you identified. So this profile basically includes everything that an open source compliance person will ask you about a product and will want to know before they tell you what kind of policy makes sense for that product. So these are the questions that I ask people about their products when I'm trying to create a policy for them. So one of the first questions is, what are the programming languages you use? Depending on the language that you use, that'll affect the kind of open source licenses that will work for you and that won't work for you. You'll also want to describe what the product does, obviously. You want to give people an idea of what it is, and particularly how it relates to your other products. So if it's a driver for something, if it's an open source component of a SaaS, you want to be specific about what it is and how it works with your other products. You want to tell that person whether or not it's a container or virtualized appliance. One thing that's kind of critical is to think about, if today, you license this product to third parties, usually for them to kind of brand with their own branding, or maybe to co-brand with you or something like that. But for example, I've seen, for example, financial institutions that come up with a product where it's basically just like an account management website, but then they'll license that account management website to other banks so that they can use it. And so if you're doing something like that, or you might do something like that, you really want to think about that because that'll also affect the kind of licensing that will be appropriate for that product. Obviously, you'd also want to know all the main contacts for that product. Who is the main engineering contact, product management, possibly even release management. Because once you start going through an open source compliance process, you're going to be in contact with all of these immediately items that you find. You'll want to track also how often the product is released in the next release, because this will affect the compliance process. Something that ships only twice a year, for example, is going to have a slightly different compliance process than something that is subject to agile development and it's a SaaS, and you might push updates to it several times a day. So how often that product is released will affect your process and how you think about compliance. And long term, as you're tracking these product profiles, you also want to track how you're doing with them, right? So did you actually create an open source profile for version 3.0 or an open source disclosure for 3.0? Did you provide source code for 3.0? Did you provide any necessary build instructions and things like that? And then depending on what kind of product you are, what product you have, what sort of obligations you have, but this is also a good place to check whether or not you submitted the product to escrow, if you have escrow requirements to anybody. So these are things that you want to track on an ongoing basis. So it's ideal to have some sort of record management system where you can track this because any compliance person is going to ask you for all this information. And over time, as you have a years-long process, you're going to switch compliance people, but you're going to want to give the new person all this information as well. So it's nice to have it in one place.
Kate, since it looks like a few people had dialed into the old WebEx and are just joining now after my having sent the email, do you want to do a very quick catch-up for those folks who have just joined?
Sure. Hi, everybody who joined. Really quickly, I'm an attorney that specializes in open source compliance, and today I'm kind of giving a peek under the hood to explain to people the process that I go through when one of my clients engages me and asks me to create an open source policy for them. So really quickly, we're calling this a third-party package policy just because you might be dealing with lots of components that aren't necessarily pure open source. You might be dealing with commercial packages. You might be dealing with freeware. So we're going to talk pretty broadly about all the things that you might find in an open source compliance audit. And so we're talking about the process that we need in order to create a policy. And so just really quickly, one of the first things that we need is to understand that you're probably going to have more than one policy because you're probably going to have different product types that require different policies. And the first step that we do when we're trying to come up with policy is to create a big inventory of all the different products that your company has to offer, and to think broadly about that to make sure you're including free things, tools, development tools, things like that. And for each of those products, this is kind of a set of questions that any compliance person is going to ask you in order to help you come up with a compliance policy. So it's a good idea to write these down and have these available for the long term, because they'll be useful for a compliance person today and a compliance person tomorrow.
Perfect. And for everyone who's joined a little late, we also are recording this, so we'll make it available for everyone to peruse at their leisure.
Yep. And because it's a small group, folks, feel free to just jump in with questions. You don't have to wait for the Q&A, because I think if you have a question, somebody else probably has the same question. So feel free. Okay, so prioritizing your inventory. So once you've come up with a list of all the different products that your company creates, makes available to either your customers or your partners, what we want to do is prioritize. You don't want to do an open source compliance process for every single product at your company. That is going to be extremely overwhelming and probably not very successful. You really just want to pick one to start with, and then you want to iterate, right? You want to go through the process with one of them, figure out where your holes are, figure out what kind of automation you need, figure out what kind of record-keeping processes you need, get all of that set up and running, and do it for the first time, and then do other products, because you'll have the background and knowledge to know what went wrong and how to fix it going forward. I think you're also going to find yourself just too overwhelmed if you try to handle too much. And the point here is to try and figure out how to do this well and how to do this efficiently. It's not necessarily to do it not well for everything. You just want to do it well and then figure out how to keep doing it. So my advice for people is to start with the product that has the most distribution. And by that I mean specifically things that get installed on customer or partner machines, whether or not you're giving people downloads, or you are actually giving people CDs, or we're talking about JavaScript. This is critical because the vast majority of open source licenses are only triggered upon distribution. So I know that this seems a little bit counterintuitive, because for a lot of folks, I think their main product is probably going to be a SaaS. It's probably not going to be something that customers download. And people say, oh, well, but that's the main product, that's what we should focus on. But that's really not where your legal risk is. You really need to focus on the things that are distributed. So it's important to note that might not be something you charge for. It might be something free. It's probably not necessarily even going to be the thing that has the most security issues for you. The other thing to keep in mind is that in terms of risk, right, the things that can be downloaded are also the things that copyright holders have access to more easily. It's something that they can more easily audit and inspect, and that's the other thing that raises the risk profile of the things that can be downloaded. So that's where I would start. So the next step would be to create categories for a third-party package policy. So from here on in, we're going to talk about an example where we're dealing with is like a proprietary desktop application. So, and the reason why I picked this example is because I think this is probably the most complicated of an example. And I think this is where we're going to see a lot of gray area. I think if you're talking about a product that's, for example, SaaS, then this is actually a much easier and much shorter discussion. So that's why I'm picking something a little bit more complicated. And obviously, these categories are what I think a proprietary desktop application would generally fall under, but it might be different for particular companies given what they're doing and how they're doing it. So, take it a little bit with a grain of salt, and obviously understand that these categories are going to be different if your product is not something that's downloaded by customers. So in terms of categories, I like to deal with sort of the green light, yellow light, red light system. So what I mean by that is that green light, these are licenses that, in your policy, they're always going to be acceptable. No matter how an engineer is using them, if it says MIT, for example, it's fine. There's no further questions, no further obligations. Just go ahead and use it. With respect to red light, it's the opposite, right? It's your blacklist. Under no circumstances should you be using these particular licenses in the product. But the bulk of where we're going to spend our discussion time is in the yellow light area. So these are licenses that where the answer is it depends. The license may be appropriate depending on either how that particular package is being used or on additional compliance steps that your engineers are either willing or not willing to take. So that's probably where we're going to spend the bulk of our time today. I think there's another category of things which I call other. So there's a lot of things out there which, I've kind of alluded to before, which are not true open source licenses in the sense that, they don't fit the principles of either the OSI or FSF, but they might still be okay for your use. And a pretty good example of that is freeware. It's licenses that they're free to use, but there's no charge, but they're not real open source licenses. And the reason might be, for example, let's say it's like an Apple SDK. So that's not really an open source license. It requires you to only use the Apple SDK on the Apple platform. So that's part of what makes it not an open source license. But the reality is if you're making a mobile application, for example, for Apple, you have to use their SDK. And so something like that, it's not open source, but you're probably still going to allow that for your product. And so I put that in the other category because it'll really depend on what it is and what the terms of it are in order for you to say yes or no to it. So it's hard to put it in a particular green light or red light category. It's something you'd really have to review one-on-one. Okay. So green light category. So this includes permissive licenses, and it includes public domain dedications. So permissive licenses, your only real obligation is to attribute the package. So somewhere in the documentation with the product, you would want to include the copyright notice as well as the licensing information for that package. So these are really simple, pretty easy to comply with. The only thing I would watch out for is there are certain licenses that look like permissive licenses. They look like BSD, for example, but they might have an advertising requirement, which says, that you also have to attribute that package and its authors in any of your advertising. For most companies, that's going to be a provision that they can't comply with, just because for functional and aesthetic reasons, you probably don't want to attribute a bunch of licensors in your TV commercials, for example, or your radio ads and things like that. So that's one thing to watch out for. And in fact, I would say that, if you see like a BSD license with that kind of clause, that might be something you end up putting in your red light category. Public domain dedications are, someone just says, I'm not claiming any copyright ownership in this, use this however you like. So those are probably also going to be great for any variety of products. The only thing to watch out for there is sometimes people make pretty bizarre public domain dedications where they'll dedicate something to the public domain, but then they'll for example, disclaim warranties or something like that. So it's not a real public domain dedication. It's still kind of a license. It might be okay to use. It depends on how it's written. The other thing to watch out for is CC0 public domain dedications. CC0 public domain dedications say, well, we don't have any copyright in this. We disclaim the copyright, but we're not disclaiming any patent licenses. Depending on who is making that public domain dedication, that may or may not be okay. It would be an ad hoc thing to look at, but just watch out for that. Okay, and then this is a category I think I may have invented, but corporate style permissive licenses. So this includes, for example, like Apache 2.0 and Microsoft public license. These are similar permissive licenses to MIT and BSD. The difference is that they give an explicit patent grant, which the other licenses don't, because they were written in a time before patent licenses on software were a big thing. These are usually going to be fine for a wide variety of products. And in fact, I would say that, Apache 2.0 has more or less become the de facto standard for corporate open source projects. A lot of Amazon things are under this license, Google, etc. And it's because it has an explicit patent grant, patent license. So companies like it because it's really clear about what you're getting. And I would say that a lot of open source projects, they're basically making the decision between, being an Apache 2.0 project, and if it's not an Apache 2.0 project, it's likely because they need to be able to be compatible with the Linux ecosystem. because Apache 2.0 and GPL2 are not compatible with each other. So you're kind of, there's like a fork in the road, and you're picking to go in one direction or the other. So these are just some examples of permissive licenses, just so you guys have a list. Okay, so yellow light. Okay, so this is kind of the meat and potatoes, and where I think a lot of conversation is going to focus on when you're writing your third-party package license. So this category includes what I would call weak copyleft and weaker copyleft licenses. So what do we mean when we say copyleft? So we talked a little bit about what it means to be permissive. So these licenses have all the same sort of principles as the permissive licenses, but they may also require that you have some or all derivative works under the same license, that any copyleft license source code is made available, and like the corporate style permissive licenses, they'll include an explicit grant for patents as well as patent-related termination provisions. So I think one of the first kind of decision-making processes here is that it is around the patent provisions that are in these licenses. So a lot of these licenses will say something along the lines of, if you sue us based on a patent for this particular package, you lose the license to this package. I think most people in the open source world will say that that's a pretty reasonable thing to say. Doesn't seem fair that you should get to use my package and also sue me for it. So I think most people will find that reasonable. I think what people can sometimes object to is that some of the older licenses in these categories, like the CPL, the MPL 1.1, they had much broader patent termination provisions where it said that not only will your license to this package end if you sue me with relation to this particular package, your license will end if you sue me in relation to any package. And obviously that's a really difficult pill for a lot of corporations to swallow because, number one, you don't know who all the contributors to a particular package were, so you could accidentally sue a contributor and lose your license without knowing that they were a contributor. And it's really hard to know, like, even if you had a contributor list, it's really hard to know what you're really looking at, right? Is John Smith on the contributor list just John Smith individually, or is that John Smith as an employee of Google, right? There's really no way to know. Not to mention that you don't know if those people have assigned their rights afterwards. So a lot of companies, tend to avoid these older licenses that have these very broad patent termination provisions because they don't want to be surprised. The reality is, I think these days you're just not going to see these licenses all that often. They're still out there, but you see them a lot less. And there isn't. I don't think I've actually seen these kind of provisions triggered during litigation because there's not that much litigation in the open source space. But I only know it's public. It may have happened somewhere, along the lines, but I may not know about it. But I would say that this risk is really small these days. I would say that it used to be a much bigger concern, is probably now a smaller concern, just kind of looking at how it's played out. So weaker copyleft. So weaker copyleft in this case means weaker than the GPL. It's a very specific turn of phrase specifically for the LGPL. I think a lot of people would just call LGPL weak copyleft along with the other licenses that are in that category, like Eclipse Public License or the CDDL and things like that. But I'm putting it in its own category here because unlike the other weak copyleft licenses, how you use an LGPL license package, how it interacts with proprietary code can affect whether or not your own proprietary code must be released under the LGPL. So that's pretty different from the other copyleft licenses because the other copyleft licenses, you can pretty much use them in any way in the package, so long as it's unmodified and it's not going to affect the licensing of your product. So that's why I think the LGPL deserves its own category. So the LGPL is a fairly complicated license because, like I said, how you use it affects its scope and whether or not your own code needs to be under LGPL. I see a lot of companies simplify the terms of the LGPL to understand that they can use LGPL code as a dynamically linked library, but you can't statically link to it. That's an oversimplification, and I think that in many cases, making decisions about the LGPL can be quite complicated because these concepts of dynamic and static linking just don't exist in a lot of languages. And so trying to apply those concepts to things that it was never intended to cover and wasn't, the license predates many of these technologies, can be difficult. But this is why the language that you write your code, that you write your product in matters for your policy, because depending on the language, you will have different ideas about whether or not you can use LGPL and still maintain your product under proprietary license. I don't want to get too in the weeds with this, but one example of this is minified JavaScript, for example. It's not something that anyone would necessarily call static linking, but kind of has a lot of the same properties. And a lot of folks have said, we think that minifying LGPL JavaScript code is the equivalent of statically linking to it. We should avoid it. So that's just an example of kind of how in the weeds you can get with this. One other note to watch out for with LGPL is that certain mobile platforms, it's not possible to do dynamic linking to other packages. You can only statically link. So this is why LGPL usage and policies are different from some mobile applications versus, for example, desktop applications. So this is where that comes in. Multi-license packages. So this is not necessarily a type of license, but it's a mechanism that you'll see out there in the world. Some packages will say, it's under this license and that license. Generally, when you see language like that, it really means you can pick one, right? If it's under MIT and GPL, it probably means pick one. The exception to this, though, is the OpenSSL SSLEA license. In that case, they really mean both, but that's really the exception. It's probably the only exception I can think of where that's the case. So you'll see this a lot, in the copyleft space, because the license choices will be either something copyleft or something permissive, or something that's strong copyleft and weak copyleft. So that's why I'm putting it in this category. The one thing to watch out for with multi-license packages is, I think generally at least one of those licenses is probably going to work for your product, but there are certain mechanisms where the way that they phrase this is, you have a choice of this license or that license, but you are required to select which license you're going to use in the source code that you produce for other parties. So I say watch out for this because I think it's easy to miss this requirement. I think because it's not just something that a compliance person can do, it's something a compliance person needs to go tell an engineer to go and do in the source code, and then make sure that when they produce source code, it's source code that they've made notes in that they actually produce. So it's not necessarily that it's difficult to comply with from a legal perspective, but it's difficult to comply with from a practical perspective. So just watch out for that. I see that a lot with respect to old Mozilla packages. So this may not be anything you ever see, but that's something to watch out for. GPL with exception. So GPL is not in the category of weak copyleft. We're going to talk about it in the separate category of strong copyleft. But I do want to mention really quickly that there's quite a few packages out there that are under GPL, but there are certain exceptions that come with that GPL. And when those exceptions are applied, I think essentially the license becomes something like weak copyleft, because it'll still require you to produce the source code for that package, but the exceptions are such that use of the GPL package with exception won't affect the licensing of your product. And so I think that GPL with exception, when you think about it in that way, really belongs in this yellow light category, because you're probably going to be okay with using that. It's probably not going to be in the red light category, and the obligations are very similar to the other copyleft licenses. The only thing I would watch out for, with GPL with exception kind of licensing is that some of the exceptions are very well known. So the GCC runtime library exception or the class path exception, very common in the open source world. Everyone has seen this. Everyone kind of understands what this means. But there's new packages created all the time with their own special exceptions, and you have to read them very carefully because not all the people who are drafting these exceptions, number one, understand the GPL, number two, understand licensing. So they might draft some pretty strange language that you really have to look at ad hoc. So if you don't recognize it as one of these popular exceptions, you really have to look at it closely and you may need further advice. So license compatibility is an issue I want to talk about. It's in this yellow light category because license compatibility, it's an issue that usually comes up when you're using weak copyleft code in your proprietary product specifically. So here's an example of this. So let's say you have proprietary code. It's statically linking to Apache 2.0. The Apache 2.0 package is in turn statically linking to LGPL 2.1. So each of these packages is either in our green light, category or our yellow light category. And we've really been talking about these packages in terms of how they interact with proprietary code, but you also need to think about the possibility of the open source packages interacting with each other. And in the case here where the Apache package is statically linking to the LGPL 2.1 package, you have a license incompatibility, right? Because I think most people would say that statically linking to LGPL 2.1 would require the thing that is statically linking to LGPL 2.1 to also be then relicensed under LGPL. But the Apache license doesn't allow for relicensing. Apache packages have to remain under Apache. So that's a license incompatibility. That's an interaction which you should avoid. On the other hand, certain open source packages communicating with each other doesn't create any problems for you. So Apache 2.0, for example, statically linking to MIT, doesn't create any license compatibility problems because neither of these packages are copyleft. So it's a little bit in the weeds, but this does happen in various products, and it's something that you need to watch out for. It's why when you're reviewing any sort of any use of an LGPL package in a proprietary product, you try to get pretty specific about how it's being used and whether or not it's interacting merely with proprietary code and how, or whether it's also interacting with other open source code and how. Okay, so these are the weaker copyleft licenses that we talked about. So just want to leave that with you. So let's move to our red light category. Now, again, I just want to remind everybody that we're talking about red light in the context of a proprietary distributed application. These red light categories may not apply or may not apply in this particular way to other kinds of products. But that's the context that we're talking about here.
And to be clear, you're talking about distributed in the sense that the software is distributed by your organization, not in the sense that it's got multiple nodes over a network.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, we're not talking about SaaS products here. So strong copyleft, the GPL. So we talked about copyleft generally. So just to underscore, with the weak copyleft licenses, with the exception of the LGPL, you're really just required to open source the modifications that you make to that particular package. You're not required to open source your entire product, right? So you can use things like the Eclipse public license, the CDDL, the MPL 2.0, all those kind of licenses, without worrying about how that's going to affect the licensing of your product. You just have to make sure that if you modify those packages, you're releasing the modifications to those packages. So with strong copyleft, that's different. Strong copyleft takes a very expansive view of what it is that becomes subject to the GPL when you use it. So within the GPL, the general idea is that anything that's a derivative work of the GPL package becomes subject to the GPL. And I think that what that means is unclear. I don't think anyone really knows what the extent of a derivative work is, but there are certain things that people generally agree on. which is that basically statically or dynamically linking to GPL will result in your application needing to be open sourced under GPL. I think that's a pretty widely held belief in the open source world. Because of the complexity of the GPL, and because you are, and also because of the sort of the risk that you're looking at, right? The idea that you might have to move from a proprietary model of licensing to licensing your product under GPL. You really want to analyze, how you're using GPL code very comprehensively. You really want to spend time on it, and you want to be diligent about it. And I think that time and complexity is why this license lands on the red light list. It's not necessarily because there aren't ways of using GPL where you're still in compliance with GPL in a proprietary product. There are ways, but the cost of doing it, the cost of doing those investigations, and then the cost of the record keeping involved is really high. And it also means that, to the extent that you're going to be using it, you basically need to have an expert on tap who's going to look at those architecture questions very closely. And if you don't want to keep an expert like that around, or you just don't have anybody who can do that, then again, that's a reason to land on the red light. I would say that we'll talk about this a little bit more, but you need fairly complex compliance processes in order to get comfortable with using GPL in a proprietary product. One note I'll make here is that just watch out for any plans for developers say something like, well, we won't include the GPL in our product. We'll just ask the customers to go get the GPL code and then use our product. That's a no-no. That wouldn't get you out of any of the obligations of the GPL or any of the consequences. So watch out for those kind of creative solutions. Generally, where people come up with creative solutions around GPL, they're generally not going to be a good idea. So I want to talk a little bit about this, a little bit more about this, because I don't want to make a controversial statement here about GPL usage. There are ways to use GPL code that may be fine in a proprietary product, and I want to talk about them. So one of the most common ones that I see is these days everybody's virtualizing everything, and everyone's shipping virtual applications, or they're shipping things in containers. So to the extent that you write an application and you ship it with a GPL licensed operating system, that's a pretty good example of using GPL with a proprietary product where that's okay, and where you would probably want to allow that use and can get comfortable with that use. There's a couple others. Communicating with GPL code via publicly available APIs. A lot of lawyers will say that that's okay. Communicating with standard language routines, merely executing GPL code. So there are exceptions. There are ways to use this. But again, this lands on the red light list, I think, because of the cost and expense of making these decisions. So let me put this in perspective for you. So if you have an engineer, let's say Greg, and Greg wants to use the GPL code as part of the product operating system, that's fine, but you'd want to keep track of how Greg is using that code, right? So Greg is using it as part of the operating system. But if another engineer, Sam, is using the exact same code, but he's statically linking to it in the product, that's a problem for you. The problem is that you need a record-keeping system where you're keeping track of Greg's use versus Sam's use of the very same open source package in the very same product. So I think for those of you who have worked with ticketing systems, approval systems, workflow systems, I think you can understand the complexity of keeping that kind of record. And so that's why I would say that this lands on the red light list, because most companies don't have a record-keeping system that's that detailed and that complex.
Since we're 10 minutes before the end of the hour, I just wanted to flag that and also say, from my perspective, we can keep this going beyond the hour, but that's obviously up to Kate's availability and whether others are able to participate. But Kate, I don't know how many more slides you have, but maybe if folks have been holding questions, now would be a good time to ask. Yeah.
I think I'm wrapping up on this. just very quickly, I want to say that ultra strong copyleft also belongs in these red light lists. This is basically the same issues that you face with the GPL, except that now you face them even within SaaS products. And there's a bunch of other things that we talked about which may or may not be appropriate for your product. These are sort of in the ad hoc list that we talked about. But I'll open it up to questions because I think these slides are self-explanatory, and you can kind of look over them without me and come back with further questions. But let's take some questions.
Remember, everyone, you are on mute. So I will unmute everyone just in case there's anybody trying to talk who has not unmuted themselves. I know this group has questions on this presentation.
Yeah, hi, it's Sally here. Hopefully you can hear me. We have prioritized our sort of risk-based criteria approach and remediating the remediation of our OSS. In terms of the priorities, we've said that we will focus on contributed OSS, external applications, so external software distribution, external applications that are external facing, so applications that deliver services directly to external parties, and server applications that are internal facing but are critical, so they're MAS or SOX related, or they're supporting our trading platforms, but they're considered to be critical. So what I was wondering is, in terms of picking that one and the sort of priority one that goes through the process, is probably going to be quite difficult. I know you mentioned picking one that gets installed on a customer or partner machine, but obviously we have around 7,000 applications in the bank, probably more now. But I think that selection process is probably going to be quite difficult for us. And obviously the remediation process. I was wondering about the roles and responsibilities. I know you've not touched on that, but how that model works typically. Do you have a separate group of people performing this analysis along with legal support as a general rule? So how normally would a large corporation set this up, their remediation model?
It'll really depend on the structure of the company. But usually, there's a team that works on a particular application. If during your compliance process you find certain open source or other code that needs to be removed, you would talk to the owner of that application, so whoever is maybe the head engineer or maybe the product manager, about what the remediation item is. And then generally that person will assign it to a specific engineer on the team that is most familiar with that package or introduce that package. So I think it's helpful if that product owner or product manager sort of oversees the engineering efforts, because it can be difficult for a compliance person to deal with 20 people or more, right, on a particular team. So you generally want a manager on the product to oversee all the engineers and oversee the remediation work. You don't want to work with engineers necessarily on a one-by-one basis. But that being
right, I suppose given the size of our organisation, it's recommended that we send out some communication prior to the activities beginning, just to alert people and make them aware this is happening.
Yeah, so there may be cases, for example, where your product manager manages a product that's very large, and in that case, that person may want to delegate to somebody else to handle the open source remediation process on that team. But I would say that you want one contact per product that's really going to be responsible for communicating with you and making sure that the rest of the team does what you want them to do.
Okay.
We have another question in the chat asking if you could talk a little bit more about static and dynamic linking and how you determine whether an application is doing one or the other. What sort of, and I would add when is this significant, and what languages and technologies do you need to be worried about this?
So this will depend on whether or not you're dealing with interpreted languages, whether or not a language gets compiled or not. This will really vary based on the particular language that you're talking about. So for example, like in C++, I think this is like really easy because it really has like dynamic and static linking, and it's kind of clear what that is. In other languages, I think that's less clear. So for example, I think like in the Java space, most people will say that calling classes is the equivalent of dynamic linking, and they'll say that there's really no such thing as static linking with Java. This really varies though by the technology. There's no blanket answer.
I guess, I think there are people on the call who probably do not have a good working definition of what static linking is, what dynamic linking is, what those terms necessarily even sort of relate to. So maybe even a step back would be worth making.
Okay. Yeah. So the difference between the static linking versus the dynamic linking, it really has to do with how closely, two different pieces of code are interacting with each other. With static linking, I think the analogy that a lot of people use is sort of like, imagine that, you're working on a document, and as part of your research, you're looking at another document. If you copy and paste a portion of that other document directly into your document, a lot of us would kind of call that plagiarism. And that would probably be close to this idea of static linking, versus if your document simply references the other document and says, go look over there for more information. A lot of us will say, oh, okay, that's more reasonable. And that's also sort of what the licensing is getting at, that by referencing the other application without necessarily copying and pasting its code into your application, there's a greater separation between the two pieces of code, and there's less likelihood of concluding that one is a derivative work of the other. This is it's a bit of an inaccurate analogy, but I think it's a pretty good one for kind of understanding the difference.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And and I'll give a little bit more colored from a specific language standpoint. So if you're compiling an application written in C, and you statically link it to another application, then what happens when the source code is turned into object code is basically those things are, the compiler takes both of those things and puts them into a single executable file, basically. And when they're dynamically linked, you could have an executable file for, the open source library on the one hand, and an executable file for the proprietary application. And the proprietary application is simply calling out to that separate executable. And so the fact that they ultimately become two different pieces of, code on the computer has been significant to some people in making determinations about, whether these things have effectively been turned into one piece of software, although, as Kate said earlier, it's best to assume that static and dynamic linking both create a derivative work of both the proprietary application and the open source library. Yeah,
I think this also, within the last decade, this has also become really murky, because even if you write the code in a way that you specify, I want to dynamically link to this, compilers will oftentimes make a different choice automatically for you. You may not have any control as to how it actually ends up because of the way that modern compilers are written. And so I think that gives it even more murkiness. And I don't know that there hasn't been enforcement with regard to this particular issue, right? I haven't seen any copyright owner go after somebody because, somebody statically linked something and they should have dynamically linked. I haven't seen that. It's more of a potential issue than it is a current one. I think the bigger concern is just its general compliance, as in, did you even disclose that you were using this open source package? Did you provide the source code to this package? I don't know that the compliance enforcement has gotten to the point where we're really talking about, you know, winking in one way versus the other. I think people are missing out on even the more basic compliance principles here.
So we are officially at the end of the hour, and again, I'm happy to stay on the line. Kate, I want to respect your time, so if you need to get back to work. Okay. You know, I think that one thing I want to highlight from this call is that hopefully it's clear to everyone having, you know, watched this presentation, and you know, I'm sure a lot of you got the same sense at the Open Source Strategy Forum or in other contexts, but it's really necessary, and you know, the foundation doesn't make you know, recommendations of specific vendors, et cetera, but it's really important to have someone like Kate, an open source attorney who really knows these things, you know, deeply. In somewhere in your stable of resources, you know, whether it's an internal attorney or it's an outside attorney who you have an ongoing relationship with, it's really important to have someone to call when you get into some of the thornier issues, because as you can see, there's a very deep well of knowledge and tradition here. Leslie, you have a question or an example to give?
I do, but I'm unclear if I'm muted.
We can hear you.
You're not muted.
Excellent.
I've unmuted you all.
Thank you. So I just want to echo Aaron's comment about the need to make sure that you're engaging with counsel who rigorously understands open source licensing, because in past lives I have worked with counsel who have been attributed as experts in open source licensing, and I have literally pulled a product launch due to a lack of understanding of the GPL 2 days before that product launch because of a misunderstanding regarding contributor licensing agreements and the use of GPL software and relicensing. So I cannot encourage folks enough to be really clear on the depth of expertise that their counsel has in open source licensing when making decisions about source code that is going to see the outside world or being distributed to a client. And I have my strong opinions about who some great lawyers are. If anyone wants to contact me for a for a reference of lawyers that I trust as a human being, not as Red Hat, based on my past experience working in open source. But I just, again, have to echo Aaron's sentiment that it is extremely important to make sure that you're dealing with counsel who actually understands open source licenses and is not assuming that they understand how they work.
I can offer similar lists. Any other questions? Sally, I know you didn't just have one question.
Well, not from me particularly. Obviously, I'm hearing a lot about GPL, and so I'm going to, you know, make sure I communicate elements of what I've heard today to our program leads. I mean, you know, what are the recommendations when we discover GPL? You know, I guess the idea is that I think I'm hearing that we have to analyze how the software is being used for every single use case. But really, in terms of the timeline, you know, we're identifying and categorizing our OSS risks, our license risks, for the high priority applications around sort of between March and September this year. We're embarking on a discovery process. We're still evaluating our tool set. So obviously this scanning process has to begin. As I mentioned, we've identified sort of at the criteria and which software we want to target. But I expect we're going to need some support, you know, around sort of Q2, Q3, some significant legal support, and we have been talking to our legal team about, the support we require from them. So it's still early days for us. It's just, how we go about this and the governance model. We're still in the process of defining this. But it's a really interesting topic, and it's very complex, obviously. So, the more information we have, this will be a real advantage in advance. So this deck and this presentation in particular is really helpful. And you did say it was going to be available online, I believe, so I'm certainly going to refer back to it. And I'll speak with the program lead, Mark, tomorrow regarding the content. But no, this has been really helpful.
I'm really glad to hear that, Sally. One thing I would say is that, when we're talking about the complex analysis of GPL, that's really in the context of distributed applications. In the context of SaaS, that analysis is a lot easier, and perhaps other products as well. So don't get discouraged. It's not a big issue for a lot of different products, but it is an issue for distributed products.
Thank you.
Any other questions? I guess a note that I'll add is it's really, I think it's common or natural coming from the perspective of a company who is just getting acquainted with the complexity of open source compliance for the first time to sort of say, why the hell do they make this so difficult? Like, why can't everyone just use a permissive license? Or why are there so many licenses? Or why is the GPL written in such, obtuse language? And having spent a lot of time representing open source community projects, and sort of watching, certainly I haven't been around since the very beginning of the open source movement, but sort of watching communities grow and expand and change or die over time. I just want to give the color that the growth of open source and the sort of growth of open source licensing over time has been, a very human process, a sort of exploration of how to do this thing of collaborative software development, community software development in different ways. And obviously, the approach differs tremendously depending on people's individual ethics, people's individual goals, people's individual trust or distrust of different types of third parties. And so while, some frustration is natural when dealing with the many complexities and sometimes incompatibilities between these licenses, I guess I would encourage folks to not judge the open source communities too harshly, but to look for ways to work with them rather than seeing the sort of corporate world and open source communities as being in conflict with one another. Well, if there are no more questions, then I think we are. We can now let Kate off the hook. Kate, this has been a tremendously helpful presentation. I know that this is sort of exactly the kind of information that our members are looking for at this stage in their development as open source contributors. And so I'm very glad that you were able to present to us today, and we would be glad to have you back anytime.
Well, thank you so much. I'm really glad to get a chance to talk to you guys. I'm really excited to learn more about the specific the industry-specific issues that you face. It's pretty fascinating because I work with a lot of purely technology companies, haven't worked with a lot of banks, so it's been a learning experience for me too, and I appreciate getting a chance to learn from all of you. So thank you for that.
Okay, and we'll again we'll have a recording of the presentation, and Kate, if it's okay for us to share your slides with our members, we will do that as well.
Yeah, of course, and anybody can feel free to reach out to me if you have any more questions. I can try to point you to other resources and things like that.
Okay, thank you, everyone.